I read a Reddit thread the other day discussing what were the most fair and unfair difficulties in Fire Emblem. The thread quickly narrowed down to a debate over whether Awakening Lunatic Plus or Thracia is more unfair, but I thought the thread brought up a couple interesting questions. 1, what does it mean for something in Fire Emblem to be unfair? And 2, is unfairness always a bad thing, or can we use it to create memorable moments and good gameplay? To start with, I want to state that Fire Emblem isn't really concerned with actual fairness. It's an asymmetrical game that isn't aiming to create two equal sides on any given map. So implicitly, when people say something is unfair in Fire Emblem, I think they either mean it's unfair in a frustrating way, or that it is unusually unfair or especially unfair compared to the normal sorts of challenges that appear in a Fire Emblem game. When I use the term unfair in this video, that's what I'm going to be talking about. Unfairness that's really frustrating, or elements that seem particularly unfair. Hopefully, by looking at what sorts of things tend to be called unfair in the Fire Emblem community, we can determine what causes something to be perceived as unfair by players. Before we dive into it though, a big thank you to my geckos on Patreon and a shout out to my skinks, Red Mage Morgan, Chicken, Morgwolf, Upscale Furry Trash, Cosplay Sylveon, Emma, Van West, Ikepoo, Lucy Sev, Romeo, Wingman, Lonely Voxel, and Aaron Gedden. I really appreciate all of your support, and if you want to support the channel and appear in videos like this, you will find a link to the Patreon in the video description. Okay, so the most common examples I hear by far about unfairness in Fire Emblem is difficult to predict reinforcements and especially ambush spawns or enemies that spawn and immediately move on the same turn, potentially killing a unit before you have a chance to react to them. These sorts of reinforcements are common in older Fire Emblem games, though they're also present in some modern entries like Three Houses and Awakening. Ambush spawns aren't the only kind of reinforcement that gets hate, though. You'll often see strong reinforcements, numerous reinforcements, or surprising reinforcements, also labeled as unfair when discussing Fire Emblem games. And beyond reinforcements, another thing people often call unfair is map objectives changing during the map. This doesn't happen that often in Fire Emblem, but an example of this would be something like Chapter 22 of Fire Emblem Engage, or the Chrom Divine Paralogue. In preps for Chapter 22, the objective appears to be to collect all the rings that are lying around the arena, but once you complete that, the objective changes to kill all enemies, which can potentially mess up your strategy, particularly if you rush to get the rings in a way that puts your units in danger because you expected the map to end when you picked up the last one. And the last common scenario that I hear called unfair is when RNG is really influential on the outcome of a map, whether this be an enemy with really dodgy hit rates, FE4 generals with Pavice, or enemies with 1-2 range and high crit. There's tons of other examples of things people consider unfair, but these commonly critiqued examples show the main factors that I believe lead people to think that something in a game is unfair. And these are hidden information, limited reaction time, and a perceived lack of agency. When combined, these traits can make a map or section of a map feel like it can't be planned around on a blind playthrough, which isn't ideal for a strategy game. Ideally, you don't want people to be trial and erroring and resetting every time a piece of hidden information is revealed. You want them to strategize and feel empowered to adjust their strategies as new challenges and information are uncovered. It is important to note, though, that all of these traits, hidden information, time to react, and RNG dependence, exist on a spectrum, and with the right balance can add fun to a map. New threats appearing on a map, or RNG-based outcomes like crits, proc skills, and misses can add the challenge of having to adjust your plans in the face of new information, or planning in ways that mitigate the influence of RNG, and I think this adds a fun layer of strategy to the games. However, as I mentioned before, by far the most common thing you see referred to as unfair in a Fire Emblem game is reinforcements. So let's look at the kind of reinforcements people consider unfair and how they've been implemented well and poorly. Reinforcements can exist at either extreme of both limited information and reaction time, and this is why some reinforcements are frequently perceived as being highly unfair, while other instances of reinforcements are not. Every reinforcement is limiting information in some way, and that's just because of how reinforcements work. A unit's going to pop up on the map, and until they pop up on the map, we will not know at least some of the following information about them. What stats the reinforcements have, how many of them there will be, their class, their items, and where and when they will spawn. But games can answer some of these questions for us in advance of the reinforcement spawning by hinting at it with cutscenes and dialogue. These types of hints can make a huge difference in whether a reinforcement spawn feels interesting and fun to play around, or unfair and frustrating. Even for ambush spawns, which are the most frustrating kind of reinforcement, signaling information to the player and smart placement of their spawn point can go a long way in making them feel interesting and interactive. Let's look at 2 ambush spawns from the same game, one of which I think is pretty fair and one of which feels a lot more unfair to me. In Awakening Chapter 9, there is a set of flyers that spawn around where your units started the map on turn 5. And at the end of turn 2, there's dialogue where enemies tell you that flyers are going to spawn behind you. This lets you know where the enemies are going to spawn, and it lets you know that they're going to be flyers. These pieces of information help you make an informed decision on how to play the map. It's the game telling you need to not be at the start of the map when the reinforcements spawn, and if you're still there after 5 turns and a warning, I do think that's more on you than the game limiting information. So in this instance, your information is imperfect, you don't know what stats the wyverns are going to have, you don't know how many, but you are provided with enough information to know that you need to get moving, and importantly, where they're going to spawn. So even though these are ambush spawns, you have ample warning and ample time to move far enough that you will not be in range of them when they spawn. And as long as that's the case, you will have at least 1 turn to react to the flyers spawning, which prevents these flyers from feeling like a gotcha. Instead, they act as a force that encourages your army to get moving, which makes the map more fun to play. For all of those reasons, this particular set of reinforcements doesn't feel unfair to me, even though they are ambush spawns that could kill one of your units the turn they spawn if you dawdle at the start of the map. I think you're given enough advanced warning that you should know not to do that. I would still prefer these reinforcements if instead of being ambush spawns, they were regular reinforcements that just spawned 1 turn earlier. They would still serve the purpose of encouraging you to get moving, but then you would be guaranteed to have at least 1 turn to react to them when they spawn. But overall, I like this set of reinforcements. In contrast, I really don't like the reinforcements in Chapter 16 of Awakening. On this map, reinforcements spawn on the sides of the map at various points on the x-axis. So why are the ambush spawns so much more annoying in this map compared to Chapter 9? For one, the signaling to the player on this map is bad. In Chapter 9, we were warned that the reinforcements were going to spawn to cut off our escape, suggesting that the enemies will spawn behind us. We're also told that the reinforcements are going to be a wyvern brigade, so we get answers as to what's coming at us and where it's coming from. In Chapter 16, we do get some dialogue warning us about the reinforcements, but instead of the more specific warning we got in Chapter 9, 16's warning is the boss saying the following. "Haha, yes, come reinforcements," said the spider to the other spiders. Unlike the warning in Chapter 9, this is basically useless. It tells us there will be reinforcements, but not where or what or when. The player doesn't have enough information to go off of here to make educated decisions besides huddling in the middle of the map, as there are no obvious locations for reinforcements to spawn from there. But even then, the reinforcements are 8-move flyers. They can get closer to the center than you might expect. Additionally, there are units with droppable items off to the sides of the map that draw you away from the middle and into the range of the ambush spawns. In Chapter 9, the reinforcements are placed behind you. So even if you didn't pay attention to the warnings the game gives you, the natural play pattern is to move forward to complete the map. This creates distance between where the reinforcements spawn and where your army is when they spawn, and this makes it unlikely you'll be in range of them when they arrive. A blind player is far more likely to get got by these Chapter 16 reinforcements because there are elements of the map encouraging them to go towards the reinforcements compared to Chapter 9, where the map is designed in such a way that your natural inclination is to go away from the reinforcements. So Chapter 16's flyer ambush spawns feel a lot worse than Chapter 9's because information about them is more hidden from the player, and they're placed in places players are more likely to be, leading to less and sometimes 0 time to react once they spawn. Chapter 16's reinforcements are actually pretty easy to deal with once you've played it and know where and when they spawn, but on your first playthrough, you lack a lot of critical information, so when a reinforcement jump scares you, it feels unfair and sort of random, and like your best course of action is to trial and error your way through the map, resetting until you learn where all of the reinforcements are, or looking up the reinforcements online. Either one is a frustrating thing to have to do when you just want to play the video game. So that's an example of reinforcements that feel fair and unfair to me. But even though reinforcements can sometimes feel unfair, they can also add interesting strategic challenges to a map or enhance the story of a map. And my favorite example of this is Thracia 776's Chapter 7. In this chapter, you are running away from a pursuing army, and this is illustrated by a whole lot of reinforcements spawning behind you starting on turn 2. These reinforcements aren't really annoying though, as the intent isn't for you to fight them at all. Rather, the intent is for you to run away from them towards the objective. And then when you do, you're even rewarded with a bunch of green units that come out and chase the red units away. Since the reinforcements spawn on turn 2 and slightly behind where you started, you won't get jump scared as long as you move at all. At which point the reinforcements serve to support the story and get you moving along. The map would have no tension without them. Chapter 15 of Engage does something similar with the more powerful reinforcements that spawn behind you as you near the end of the map. You can fight these reinforcements, but that's not really the point of them. They're there to add tension and make sure you get moving towards the objective, sort of like a much more diegetic turn limit, though one that can be averted using terrain or if your units are strong enough to fight them. Whether these reinforcements are fair or not is up to the user's interpretation, but either way, Chapter 7 of Thracia and Chapter 15 of Engage are better for having these reinforcements, even if they might be perceived as unfair by some. Alright, so that was a lot on reinforcements, but there are other ways that Fire Emblem uses hidden information and limited planning time in a way that may be perceived as unfair, but that also may make a map more fun and memorable to play. A good example of this is Chapter 11 of Fire Emblem Engage. This is a generally well-received map, but one I've seen many folks call unfair, and I believe the reason for this is that unlike most other maps in Engage, you do not get to go back to the Somniel before Chapter 11. You have to use the units that you used on the previous map, and you lose access to a lot of tools, including all of the emblem rings and the time crystal that you've had access to for the past 10 chapters or so. Not to mention, if you had anyone die in Chapter 10, you are basically just down a deployment slot in this chapter. And you don't have access to shops to replenish any spent resources like staves that you may have run out of in Chapter 10. Now, the game does warn you before you start Chapter 10 that you'll be playing a couple maps in a row, and this alleviates some potential issues. You should know to do your shopping and foraging before Chapter 10 at least. But players will still be caught by surprise by a lot of Chapter 11, especially losing the rings. Which is why I've seen some people say this map is unfair, as there's a lot of new information sprung on you and limited access to preps. And I'm not going to argue whether the map is fair or not, ultimately there's a lot of subjectivity there. But I will argue that this map is good, and the factors that can make it feel unfair are also the factors that make it so good. In the story, Alir has just lost all the rings, narrowly escaped Sombron, and is now fleeing Vale's army of soldiers wielding the rings that we just lost. It's an unfair situation in the narrative, so it makes perfect sense to put the player in an unfair situation in gameplay, and it's one that challenges you to play the game in a slightly different way than you've become used to. No more rings, time to show off your fundamentals. The map also isn't as brutal as it looks. Once you get far enough along the map, you get the time crystal back as well as a pair of rings and 3 good units to get you across the finish line. And because the beginning of the map feels a little unfair and challenging, these 3 units that show up at the end of the map to help you out make an even better impression than they would otherwise because they're helping you overcome this unique set of challenges that Chapter 11 offers. So while the game removing some options from you for a chapter and not giving you much time to react to it can feel unfair, it's also what makes this map so memorable and fun. All of this is to say that unfairness may not be the best metric to measure whether a map or game is good. Things that feel unfair can be fun. Thracia's early game is built around fighting an army stronger than yours and running away from powerful enemies, but it's one of my favorite early games in the series. And fair doesn't always mean fun either. There are lots of maps with no gotcha reinforcements or surprises, but they can also be boring to play. So I think designers shouldn't be afraid of including elements in their games that can feel unfair, as long as those elements are providing some other positive value, whether that be an unfair element creating a challenge that's interesting to think through, or the element strongly tying the gameplay to the story, or anything else that might add value to a map. And on the player's side, I think that players could stand to put a little bit more thought into some of the challenges that we sometimes call unfair, and at least give a fair shake at engaging with the map and the challenges that it provides. Not saying no maps can be frustratingly unfair, but I think sometimes as a community we are quick to call a map that seems difficult or frustrating at first glance unfair, without considering all of the tools that the game may give you to engage with this difficult challenge. So those are my thoughts on fairness and reinforcements in Fire Emblem. But what do you think? What elements of Fire Emblem have you found unfair? And are there any that are commonly called unfair that you disagree with? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video, and if you liked it and you want to see more content like it, consider hitting the like or subscribe button so that you never miss an upload. If you want to chat about Fire Emblem more, consider joining the community Discord linked in the video description. Either way, thanks for hanging out, and have yourself a lovely week.